You think you've heard it all about medieval history. But what if I told you that behind the castles, the knights, and the so-called chivalry, there existed sexual practices so bizarre, so grotesque, and so dehumanizing, they would make modern society shudder in disbelief. You've heard the legends of King Arthur and his knights, but what about the dark, twisted rituals that took place behind closed doors? These weren't just the excesses of a few degenerates. These were the institutionalized, accepted behaviors of entire kingdoms, supported by laws, religious doctrines, and social hierarchies. This isn't about love stories or romanticized medieval culture. This is about the practices that history conveniently ignores, or worse, sanitizes. Today we're diving into the hidden world of the medieval era, where sexual violence wasn't just a weapon of war, but an intricate part of the social fabric. Brace yourself, because what you're about to learn will shock you, disturb you, and challenge everything you thought you knew about the so-called Dark Ages. Let's begin with the most disturbing and chilling truth about medieval warfare. Rape wasn't merely an inevitable byproduct of war, it was a deliberate tactic. In the brutal world of the medieval era, conquering armies didn't simply plunder wealth or seize control of territory. They took women, young and old, as spoils of war. But these acts weren't the result of random lust or isolated instances. They were part of a coordinated, legal, and systematic strategy ingrained deeply in the practices of the time. The most shocking part? This wasn't the work of rogue soldiers or the barbarians at the gates, as we might think. It was institutionalized, integral to the very framework that governed warfare in the medieval period. Captive women weren't merely victims, they were regarded as valuable assets, mere property. Entire families, villages, and even royal courts endorsed and accepted this brutal treatment. It was a widely condoned practice that formed part of the warfare and societal structures of the time, often hidden behind the veil of chivalric ideals or religious justification. Take the infamous event of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the Crusaders stormed and sacked Constantinople. The scale of sexual violence during this event was horrifying. Byzantine women were taken by the hundreds, their bodies ravaged by soldiers in the most brutal of ways. Age, social status, or virtue made no difference. The violence was indiscriminate, and the soldiers took what they wanted with no regard for the consequences. The atrocities weren't just tolerated, they were actively encouraged and rewarded. Soldiers who engaged in such acts were promised great rewards, wealth, land, or even social advancement. To the victors went not only the territory, but the women as well. But what's even more disturbing is the role of the medieval church in this system of exploitation. Instead of condemning these acts, many religious authorities often turned a blind eye or even supported the practice as a means to maintain power and control. The theological justifications for such violence were staggering and repugnant. Sexual violence was often framed as a necessary evil, a divine punishment against the conquered people, or worse, as a form of spiritual cleansing. The church, rather than serving as a moral compass, became complicit in the system of sexual subjugation. And this wasn't just a matter of soldiers seizing women in the heat of battle. No, this was part of a far darker and more organized system, one that utilized sexual violence as a mechanism of control and terror. The medieval era saw the creation of entire systems of slavery and sexual exploitation that were deeply embedded in the fabric of society. Women who were captured in war were often forced into sexual slavery, not only for the pleasure and satisfaction of their captors, but also as a means of asserting dominance over entire populations. The violence wasn't random. It was a tool used by the conquerors to demoralize, degrade, and control the conquered, ensuring their subjugation for generations to come. Now let's step inside the holy walls of the medieval church, a place that was supposed to be sacred, pure, and divine. Yet, beneath its robes and incense, there existed secret, unspoken practices that were as dark as the sins they were supposed to absolve. For centuries, the church didn't just provide spiritual guidance. It also became a place where the powerful could hide their darkest secrets, their most perverse desires. Clergy members who were sworn to celibacy were often the perpetrators of these grotesque acts, sometimes in the very sanctity of the church itself. But there was a disturbing twist to these illicit activities. Many of these clergy members would conduct sexual rituals under the guise of religious ceremonies. In the 13th century, a notorious cult called the Cistercian monks spread across Europe. These monks were known not only for their religious devotion, but for their secret sexual rites. Under the cover of darkness, they would conduct so-called spiritual orgies, which were framed as methods of purging sins and strengthening faith. It was believed that through these rituals, the soul could become closer to God. But in reality, they were manipulating religion to satisfy their sexual urges. One of the most bizarre practices among these monks was called the night confessions. Men and women would strip naked in front of the priests, seeking atonement for their sins. But rather than granting forgiveness, the priests would engage in sexual acts with the penitents, justifying it as a form of divine penance. The fact that this was institutionalized, with elaborate rituals and sanctioned by some of the highest religious authorities, shows just how deeply intertwined power, religion, and sexuality were during this period. Moving from the holy to the royal, we encounter an even more disturbing reality. Medieval royalty didn't just rule through political power, they ruled through sex. In the royal courts of medieval Europe, the line between authority and sexual dominance was so blurred that what we would now call abuse was, in many cases, seen as a right. Take the infamous case of King Henry VIII, who wasn't just known for his 6 marriages and bloody reign. He was also notorious for using sex as a tool to secure his political power. Women were chosen not only for their beauty or royal blood, but also for their ability to provide the king with a male heir. But what happened to those who didn't fulfill their duty? Anne Boleyn, the mother of Queen Elizabeth I, was executed for alleged infidelity, although most modern historians agree that she was simply a pawn in Henry's cruel game of power. Anne's execution wasn't just political, it was deeply sexual. She was accused of having unnatural relations with her brother and several others in the court, a charge that was as much about her sexual behavior as it was about her failure to deliver a male heir. But the royals didn't stop there. In some kingdoms, concubines and mistresses weren't just side attractions, they were part of the royal machinery. A king's ability to control women through sex was not just a personal indulgence, it was a means of exercising dominance over rival factions, kingdoms, and even religions. At the very core of medieval society, one institution above all others was responsible for the oppression and subjugation of women: marriage. But not the type of romantic, fairy tale marriage that modern stories often depict. No, medieval marriage was, first and foremost, a business transaction, an arrangement crafted to consolidate power, land, and wealth. Women in this system were seen as nothing more than property. They were exchanged between families like livestock, used as pawns in a game of political maneuvering and dynastic consolidation. The concept of love had little to do with it. The true driving force behind marriage was economic and social stability, with women's roles confined to those of bearers of children and, in many cases, symbols of status. Take the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine. A woman of immense power, wealth, and intellect, Eleanor's story is a perfect example of how women of noble birth were not afforded true agency over their lives. Eleanor was married at a young age to the future King Louis VII of France, but this wasn't the kind of passionate union we romanticize today. Rather, it was a political maneuver designed to strengthen the ties between two powerful dynasties, an arrangement made to benefit the families, not the individuals involved. While Eleanor had power and wealth in her own right, she was still a mere bargaining chip in a game of political chess. Despite her immense personal influence, she found herself married off twice, first to Louis VII, then to Henry II of England, without ever truly having the right to choose her own fate. Her marriages were not about love or mutual respect, but about securing power and territorial control for her family. The reality of marriage in the medieval era was far from the idyllic image we often have. The power dynamics of these unions were not just reflections of personal desires or love. They were institutionalized practices that placed women in a subordinate transactional role. Fathers routinely sold their daughters to the highest bidder, not considering their happiness or desires. These marriages were designed to advance the political or economic interests of families, leaving women with no say in the matter. Many of these unions were consummated through ritual, with the act of sexual intercourse not as a symbol of love or commitment but as a political statement. The virginity of the bride was often treated as a precious commodity, a valuable asset that symbolized purity, and the loss of that virginity during the marriage's consummation was viewed as the final, sacred seal of the alliance. However, this so-called consummation had little to do with the emotional connection between the partners. The true intent behind the act was power, control, and dominance. It was a public declaration of ownership, a way for the husband to assert his control over his wife, to solidify the union not with love, but with authority. Marriage was rarely about the bond between two individuals. It was about securing alliances, expanding territories, and consolidating wealth. Women were trapped in a system where their worth was tied to their ability to produce heirs, to strengthen familial lines, and to maintain their husband's wealth and status. This institutionalized system of marriage reinforced a societal structure that viewed women as property, valuable, yes, but still subordinate. And while women like Eleanor of Aquitaine could wield influence, they were still bound by the rules of a society that saw them not as independent individuals, but as key assets in the complex game of medieval politics. The true nature of medieval marriage wasn't just about the joining of two people. It was about the control of power, the exchange of wealth, and the unyielding dominance of women. And what about the knights? The very symbol of medieval honor, bravery, and virtue. Were they the paragons of virtue they've been made out to be in popular culture? Hardly. In reality, the concept of chivalry was just a thin veneer that masked a brutal, often sexually violent reality. Medieval knights, far from being the noble warriors we imagine, were often nothing more than sexually aggressive mercenaries. They frequently used their status to demand sexual favors from peasants, women of noble birth, and even young boys. Their honor wasn't about protecting the weak, it was about dominating them, sexually, physically, and emotionally. One of the most disturbing aspects of knightly culture was the ritual of the knighthood bath. After undergoing a series of tests to prove their strength and valor, knights would undergo a ceremonial bath. But this wasn't just a physical cleansing, it was a ritualized sexual initiation. Young squires, often in their early teens, were required to submit to sexual acts with older knights, who would then initiate them into the ways of the warrior class. This brutal practice wasn't seen as a crime, it was a rite of passage. As we wrap up this unsettling journey through medieval sexual practices, one thing is clear. The era was not defined by its knights and kings or its towering cathedrals. It was defined by systems of control, exploitation, and a deep-rooted culture of sexual violence that permeated every level of society. From the royal courts to the monasteries, from the battlefields to the villages, sex was a tool used for dominance, control, and humiliation. The historical record has often tried to sanitize these practices, painting a picture of a noble past. But the truth, as we've seen, is far darker. The medieval era was one in which the power to control others was exercised through sexual violence, and it was a practice deeply embedded in the very structures of society. If you think this history is a distant memory, think again. The roots of these practices can still be seen in many parts of the world today. Understanding this history is crucial, not just for confronting the past, but for recognizing the patterns of oppression that continue to shape our world. So, next time someone romanticizes the medieval era, remember this. It wasn't a time of honor and virtue. It was a time of brutality, where the powerful used sex as a weapon, and the victims, as always, were the powerless. If you found this history as disturbing as it is enlightening, don't forget to subscribe. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The past, as they say, has a way of repeating itself. Only by confronting it head-on can we ensure that we don't fall prey to the same forces of oppression and exploitation today.